A central character in Tolkien's novel The Lord of the Rings is a man called Aragorn, contemptuously known as Strider. He is the last hope, the promised one, descending from the last true king of Gondor. His kingdom is administered by the stewards, who, whilst notionally serving him, in fact reign there, whilst he, the rightful king, lives in exile. He is despised and scorned by those he works tirelessly among, protecting and defending them without thanks and acknowledgement. He says, "Strider I am to one fat man in Bree, who lives a day's journey from foes who would freeze his heart." Yet throughout the story, until his hour comes, he rides unknown and in obscurity, and it is only on rare occasion that he allows his power, nobility and glory to shine. In the final volume of the story, The Return of the King, he returns to his own land, to the city that he is rightfully king of, where the current steward on the throne refuses to recognise him as king. But after a number of battles with the great enemy, he enters the city in humility to heal the sick. And having done so, he leaves to fight the final battle, after which he returns to be crowned and acknowledged the only rightful king. So where did he get these ideas from? This is, of course, is fiction, but the narrative Mark is telling us about is true. It is based on a greater king than Aragorn could ever have been, on a greater kingdom than Gondor ever was. In our study of Mark, like Mike has said, Rod, Mike and I have been preaching consecutively through for several months now. We're just over 2/3 the way through. We're in chapter 11. But in terms of time, we're actually very, very near the end. I don't think sometimes we realise how compressed the timescales are at the end of the Gospels. Last week, in the second half of the previous chapter, Mike spoke to us about Jesus on his way up to Jerusalem, making his journey to the final visit to Jerusalem. And we know from the Gospel of John that Jesus had visited Jerusalem many times before, as most Jewish males would for the major festivals. But Mark has not mentioned this. Mark's account has been ordered for one purpose, and that is to proclaim the gospel, the good news concerning Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And this chapter marks a new episode in his mission. From this point onwards, except for a few verses at the end of the book, all events occur in and around Jerusalem, and it is for the next few days that they will happen. We have come to near the end of the book. We have commenced what is called Passion Week, which means that this day, Sunday, which the church calendars call Palm Sunday, it's a Sunday, and by Friday night, Jesus will have been crucified. So from now on, almost to the end of the book, everything that we read will happen in these final 5 days. Now, we are, I'm sure, familiar with the events of Palm Sunday, but I confess I didn't really understand their significance, how important they were. We've come to the climax to which Jesus, the Son of God, the Messiah, the hope of Israel, had come. Long prophesied and awaited Messiah had come to his own city, and he has come to judge. And this is such significance that it is one of the few incidents that is recorded in all 4 Gospels. And as such, I'm going to depart from what we've normally done in Mark, where we've just really stuck with what Mark is saying, and we'll use material from the other Gospels, Matthew, Luke and John. Yet Mark makes very little explicit reference to the messianic credentials of Jesus. Up until now, Jesus has not sought public acclamation. He takes steps to mute, whether from those he has healed, from his disciples or even demons, his fame. He's actually not wanted any applause or recognition. And even in this quite important event that's going to happen, Mark himself doesn't refer to the Old Testament prophecies being fulfilled, but instead he just tells us what is happening as it would have been seen. Mark knows that he's narrating about the Messiah, and he and his readers will know its significance, but he has chosen not to let that colour his narrative. And why has he done that? Because Mark's message is to those who have faith. And it's to confirm the faith of those who believe. And as such, what he says here is significant for his hearers to know and to be sure. And then got to be sure that the one that is described is God's Messiah. He is Jesus, the Son of God. He's not telling people what they should believe and what they should see. He's telling them how it's happened so that they will, from what they know, they will see it for themselves. They will know, without anyone telling you, that what Mark has told them is true. And they will see the full significance of what's going on. So we'll come to the passage. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and just as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden, and tie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'What are you doing? Why are you doing this?' say, 'The Lord needs it, and we'll send it back here shortly.'" They went and found a colt outside in the street, tied at a doorway. As they untied it, some people standing there asked, "What are you doing, untying that colt?" They answered as Jesus had told them to, and the people let them go. So Jesus has come up from Jericho. Mike told us what happened there last week. And there he has healed blind Bartimaeus. And now he's come up the journey, about 13 miles, to the Mount of Olives, which rises about 2,600 feet above sea level. It stretches on the east side of Jerusalem, north and south. And in Judaism, it's got great significance because there, Zechariah in 14 identifies it as a place where the Messiah, on his great final return, will arrive, and he will stand on that mountain. The road that pilgrims took led through Bethany, which is about 2 miles out of Jerusalem. And we know from John that the Lord has probably stayed there with Martha and Mary and Lazarus. When he comes to Bethphage, that's a sort of location, a district closer to Jerusalem, and it falls within the precinct of Jerusalem, and it marks the limits within which items of the temple could be prepared and used. So it's very, very close to the city. So Jesus sends 2 disciples ahead where he tells them where they'll find a colt, a young donkey that has never been ridden on, and there they are to untie it. And Jesus tells them in advance exactly what is going to happen and what are they to do if they're challenged. He prepares them with words to answer when they are challenged. And so when the people who are with the colt understandably ask, "What on earth do you think you're doing?" it's like someone going around and nicking a car. It's sort of thing, well, it's understandable why people are curious to know why they think they have the right to do this. The Lord tells them what to say to them. They are to say, "The Lord needs it and will send it back shortly." And it seems clear that the owner recognized the authority of Jesus because he lets them go without question. And it's interesting because we don't know who this man was. Rod, I think, mentioned last week that obedience to God takes many forms. Often what God asks us to do may not be the service we dreamed of or wanted. We often wished it was not us or that we could do something else. But the important thing is to be willing to serve God in the situations that God actually puts us in, not in the ones we think we ought to be in. Here, the owner of the donkey, someone we know nothing of, is content to wait and be ready to provide his own donkey in service of Jesus. Now, we wonder why has Mark spent 6 verses out of the 11 talking about providing transport to Jerusalem, because actually Jesus normally never used a donkey. Jesus normally walked everywhere. He didn't even need a donkey, so why did Mark spend 6 verses discussing obtaining a donkey? And the reason is though Mark doesn't explicitly say this, there is an allusion of a colt tied in the Oracle of Judah, which is something that Jacob said to his children, particularly his son Judah, in Genesis 49:11, spoken nearly 2,000 years previously. And it says this, "The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his. He will tether his donkey to a vine, his colt to the choicest branch." And in other translations, the footnote, "he to whom it belongs," is called enigmatically Shiloh. And pre-Christian Jewish texts usually regarded this as a reference to the coming Messiah, 2000 nearly BC. Now, the allusion given in the text is to a donkey. And the idea is that the untying of the colt itself was a messianic sign. The idea of a colt, one that had never been used, no one had ever ridden on it, carried the idea of purity. It was something holy. Quite apart from this, it's quite remarkable that Jesus was able to ride a donkey, an unbroken donkey, a donkey that no one had ever ridden before. Now, I understand horses have to be broken in. Donkeys, I understand, are even more stubborn than horses. Yet Jesus had no problem. The donkey willingly let him ride it without a bridle, without spurs, without anything, into Jerusalem. Another interesting little side effect, maybe we think it's slightly tenuous. Justin Martyr was an early Christian writer. He was born towards the end of the 1st century. But he reported even then an early tradition that the donkey, when the disciples released it, was actually tethered to a vine. So take that for what it's worth. But there's a more direct prophecy at play here from over 500 BC by the prophet Zechariah. It's referred to in Matthew and John. And it says this: "Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." So what is reported is part of a section. The actual text is longer. And like many quotes that the New Testament uses, it's not some kind of loose reference. Well, it used donkey back there. We'll haul this into thee just to prove our point. This is a real reference. If you go back, and the Jews would have known what this text was all about, you get the full force of what the quote is saying. Because it goes on to say, "I will take away the chariots from Ephraim and the war horses from Jerusalem. And the battle bow will be broken. He will proclaim peace to the nations. His rule will extend from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. As for you, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I will free your prisoners from the waterless pit." And so this text tells us, in addition, we have the coming of a gentle king, one who will bring the end of war. He will bring to the nations peace worldwide, to the ends of the earth. And, perhaps as important, his coming is associated with the blood of God's covenant that spells release for prisoners. He's prophesying the return and the coming of the Messiah. So the text carries on. "When they brought the colt to Jesus and threw the coats over it, he sat on it. Many people spread their cloaks on the road, while others spread branches they had cut in the fields." Now, it's hard for us in perhaps an irreligious age to imagine the scale and importance to the nation of the major religious festivals, particularly the Passover. Many would be coming up from the country, in addition to those who had come up with him from Galilee. And his own followers and the crowds would have been immense. A writer of that period, Josephus, mentions one Passover which happened just before the Jewish war, about 30 years later, where he reckoned that between 2 and 3 million worshippers came up to Jerusalem. Now, I'm not saying there would have been that many there, but you can imagine that the crowds would have measured in the hundreds of thousands. This wasn't just a few people going to church. This was a major event, a national event. It would make football, pale into significance. There'd have been crowds several times the size of a capacity stadium at Wembley, all going to Jerusalem to worship. Now, not only that, Jesus' fame had grown. His fame as a prophet, teacher, healer were known. And news had spread to the religious leaders of the raising of Lazarus. However, there was talk even more than this. He was now being referred to as the Son of David. We heard last week how Bartimaeus cried, "Jesus, thou Son of David." So that even the religious leaders who did not believe were getting concerned about this level of popularity and the potential for this to excite serious notice from the Romans. It may have been a popularist dream that the Messiah would come and restore the kingdom to Israel, but that dream was not theirs. Now, nowhere in the Gospels does Jesus ride an animal apart from here. And normally, all pilgrims ascending to Jerusalem would walk. And that's what Jesus would normally have done. And he is obviously riding this animal of special significance to fulfill the prophecies that we've just read. And he's doing it deliberately, whether people understand him or not, because he is fulfilling prophecy. The colt has no saddle, so they just placed their coats on it. People spread branches and even clothes in front, preparing a road for Jesus, if you like, a red carpet treatment. And the branches could have been leaves, they could have been tall grass, but John's Gospel mentions palm trees. Date palms were plentiful around Jerusalem. And palm branches at that time, and had been for the last 2 centuries, were a nationalistic symbol of Israel, a nationalistic symbol of the hopeful Messiah. And so in this highly charged atmosphere, the crowd of his disciples were excited, and their hopes and dreams burst out, and their mood infects the multitudes around them. All right. So those who went ahead and those who followed shouted, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest heaven." There are crowds in front and behind, and people are coming out of the city to see what is going on, to meet him. And almost spontaneously, they start repeating these words which we've just read. So what are they saying, and why are they saying it? The cry, "Hosanna, give salvation now," had been an acclamation of praise. Every Jew knew of its occurrence in Psalm 118, because it was part of the Hallel, the psalm sung every morning by the temple choir during the major feasts. The blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord appears in the same psalm and was understood by the rabbis as referring to the Messiah. The crowds are not simply pronouncing a blessing in the name of the Lord. They are pronouncing a blessing on the one who comes in the name of the Lord. And if this wasn't clear enough, they then say, "Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David." This is not a quote from the psalm, but a messianic identification of he who comes in the name of the Lord, saying who he is. It came from a set of blessings which were offered daily for the restoration of the kingdom of David. And the final Hosanna is an appeal to God to bring this era of salvation. Again, an expression of the nation's hope of the Messiah. But they actually seem to have little awareness that it was happening now. What was happening? Did the crowds actually understand what they were saying? Now, it seems that the Pharisees understood all too well what was being implied, so well that they were very offended, and they actually told Jesus to stop his disciples saying it. But for the large crowds, many were just being swept up in the moment. When they got to Jerusalem, when people asked them, "So who is this all about?" They said, "Oh yeah, this is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee." That was their answer. Even the disciples did not fully understand, but for a different reason. They did not realize the prophecy was being fulfilled, and would not realize it until Jesus was glorified. We know that because John says so. Yes, they believed that Jesus was the Messiah, but it was not the Messiah that God had promised, meek and lowly. Their Messiah that they were expecting was one who was about to redeem Israel, restore its fortunes and make that nation great again. It was the desire that they wished for, and who did everything they thought needed to be done. But it was not the Messiah who had actually come. It was not the promised Messiah from God. Jesus entered Jerusalem and went into the temple courts. He looked around everything, and since it was already late, he went to Bethany with the 12. It all comes to almost an anticlimax at the end. He comes into the city. When it says he went into the temple courts and looked around, he wasn't looking around like a tourist, just he'd come here to see what was going on in Jerusalem. It was like he was coming to see what was his by right, to see what was being done there. He was inspecting his property, his father's house, currently in the care of unworthy husbandmen. And next day, he's going to return to put things right. And then he returns to Bethany, probably back to the home of Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. And as for the crowds, they all went home to their lodgings in the surrounding countryside. It all seems an anticlimax. The excitement and mood dissipated, but this was the beginning of the week. Whether they understood it or not, it was necessary that Jesus would fulfill this prophecy. I wasn't hesitant to mention this next bit. It's not normally mentioned, and it perhaps sounds a bit way out and speculative. 5 centuries earlier, the prophet Daniel wrote this: "Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublous times. And after 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself." It's an interesting thought. The date of the edict by the Persian king to restore Jerusalem happened actually after Daniel had died. He never saw that edict happen. He prophesied that a Gentile king will enact an edict to build Jerusalem again. And we believe that probably happened about 445 BC. The prophecy also says 483 years later, after that edict, that is 69 units of 7 years, would be until the appearing of the Messiah, the Prince. And using a common definition of the Jewish year, which was 360 days, it works out at 173,880 days from that decree to the day of the triumphal entry, fulfilling that prophecy to the day. It sounds almost incredible. This was no accident that it happened. This had been promised long. This was on God's timescale. It had now happened. The Messiah had come. He hadn't finished, but there's more to be done. In conclusion then, 2 points. The Messiah has come. Jesus is the rightful Messiah. He was then and he still is. And the implications of this are as profound today as they were then. If Jesus is king, then we, if we follow him, owe him total allegiance and obedience. But what kind of Messiah do we follow? In that day, the people had already decided what their Messiah should be like. Their Messiah would come with power and rescue the nation, sit on the throne and restore the nation to power. He would make Israel great again. They did not want and could not accept the Messiah prophesied by Zechariah, humble, meek and lowly, coming to endure the shame of the cross. In fact, the Jews had a problem with that text of Zechariah. They could not accept that the Messiah could come meek and lowly. Surely he would come with the clouds of heaven. And so their way around it was, if Israel is good, then Jesus will come. The Messiah will come in the clouds of heaven. If he is unworthy, then he will come in humility. But of course, the lesson to us is, as servants and followers of Jesus, should we aspire to be any more than our master? Should we aspire to be great and powerful? Rod has mentioned this last week, that this was the humility of Jesus, and we are expected to follow in his steps. Sometimes we get this upside down, even our reading the Bible, where we're trying to sometimes find ourselves in passages rather than finding Jesus there, because he is at the centre. If we are worth anything and have value and have any part to play, it is only because of Jesus. G.K. Chesterton wrote a poem called The Donkey, and he was really parodying the idea where people get this wrong, that they look at the Bible and see themselves there. The donkey, in the final verse of this poem, has been going through the events of Palm Sunday. He is a centre stage there, he thinks, and is saying, whatever you think of me, know this. Fools, for I also had my hour. One far fierce hour and sweet, there was a shout about my ears and palms before my feet. The donkey had thought it was all about him, forgotten that he was just playing a part. And so in our Christianity, we must never forget we are playing a part. It is Jesus who is centre stage. But I think we have a different issue today. We're quite happy with a Jesus in humiliation. We want a saviour, a friend, someone not too different to us, and someone who will help us out in our needs and problems, who provides only comfort and has minimal expectations of us. But the Jesus we serve, the real Jesus, is a king. He is royal and glorious. We owe him our worship and total allegiance freely out of love, because he is worthy of it. Christianity is not a self-help program, and our primary concern is not what can Jesus do for me, We live to serve him, and our lives are not our own. Second point, Jesus is coming again, and his return will be as different to his first coming as you could possibly imagine. The Jesus who we worship and are waiting for will return in power and great glory. It will be a great and terrible day. The earth and stars and sun, all that was or will be, exists for his sake, and he is coming, the most dreadful, the most beautiful, the most glorious one. He will come, and yet his coming will be for us. We are no one, and yet we count for his sake. In The Lord of the Rings, the returned king arrives at his own city and enters in obscurity. And he there heals those who are under the power of death, and in particular the son of the late steward. When he awakes, the man says, "My lord, you have called me, I come. What does the king command?" The king replies, "Walk no more in the shadows, but awake, rest a while, and take food, and be ready when I return." "I will, Lord, for who would lie idle when the king has returned?" Jesus has come, and is most surely coming again. Let's be ready.